Hello and welcome to this Q&A discussing the challenges of initial margin compliance for buy-side firms and the role of automation in the drive for more efficient collateral management processes. Joining me today is David White, Head of Sales for triResolve, part of the Next Group, who has been working with some of the larger derivatives dealers caught by initial margin rules in phases 1 and 2 of the regulations. David, up to an estimated 2,000 buy-side firms could come into scope for initial margin between now and 2020 and will need to prepare for the complexities ahead. What trends have you observed so far among firms in phases 1 and 2?
Thanks, Phil. There's many, but I think the overriding and big one to take away is the market's adoption of the ISDA standard initial margin model. So to give that a little bit of context, if you go back to the initial margin rules, the rules dictate that you can calculate initial margin in one of two ways, either through a regulatory approved model or through a schedule-based percentage of notional approach. The latter doesn't really allow for much netting, it's quite expensive. So the ISDA standard initial margin model has provided exactly what it sort of says on the tin, a standard way for the market to calculate initial margin.
So what do you see as the key challenges that firms face in complying with initial margin requirements?
I think there's three big challenges, and these tie, of course, in large part to the ISDA standard initial margin model, as that's the way the market has gone. Again, for context, the ISDA standard initial margin model is a table-based sensitivity calculation. So calculation is arguably quite easy. You can get the calculation off the shelf from ISDA. However, working with it on a daily basis, you need to be able to firstly calculate the inputs into that calculation. That requires you to calculate trade sensitivity. So that's undoubtedly a big challenge. The next big challenge is, right, if you've been able to calculate those inputs, feed them into the calculation, then how are you then going to efficiently agree and exchange those margin calls with your counterparty? And then finally, the third one is, Phil, what if you and I were using SIM, we're therefore using the same calculation method and we have a dispute? Well, the inputs to that calculation must be different from your side and from my side. So therefore, we need to reconcile those sensitivities to be able to have a coherent dispute resolution process.
Okay, I see. Thank you. And how can automation help, and where is it most effective?
Well, I think this speaks to both initial margin and variation margin, but because initial margin is new, undoubtedly there has to be a focus on trying to ensure accurate collateralization. Collateral management is an extremely effective risk mitigation tool if the collateralization is accurate. Now, if firms can automate their processes, all the stuff that can be automated, then what they can do is free up resource to focus on the exceptions that are presented out of the back of that automated process. If they do that, then they can spend more time on the disputes. If they do that and spend more time working at resolving those disputes, there is less risk in the market, there is less risk to them as a firm. So for me, that is key. And key to driving that automation is automating that margin call exchange and agreement. And also, when we talk about that dispute resolution method, having an efficient way of reconciling these sensitivity differences and being able to identify where those differences reside, but perhaps most importantly, to have a method to tell you not only where those differences reside, but what differences are driving the dispute on any one day.
So what factors should firms consider when they're developing an automation strategy? What does good look like in that respect?
Sure. I mean, for me, the biggest one is, automation is very difficult, if not impossible, if you have a bifurcated collateral management model. So what participants should do is consider, if they're not building it themselves, then which vendor can provide a solution for all parts of the process. And I speak to that both from an IM and VM perspective. So can the solution that I employ calculate the inputs to the VM process, mark to market? Can the vendor I'm looking at produce the inputs to the initial margin calculation, sensitivities? Can I have an automated process around the exchange and agreement of those margin calls? And do I have an automated and efficient way to resolve those disputes with my counterparties, not my own, with my counterparties? If you can find a vendor that can provide all of that and have a seamless data flow between all of the constituent parts, then you maximise your chance of the fullest automation possible.
David, thank you. You can find more information on initial margin on the risk.net website.